Good morning and welcome back to the News Bulletin coming to you live from Warsaw. I'm Salia Strzemska. Allies of Ukraine are considering providing the war-torn country with more long-range missiles. That is one of the topics discussed today in London during a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing, where Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy will also be present. The call for increasing Ukraine's long-range ballistic capabilities comes from British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who is hosting the meeting of 20 allies of Ukraine. His call comes after the United States failed to pledge Tomahawk missiles to Kyiv. Another hot topic on the agenda is the proposal to use 140 billion euros of frozen Russian assets as a loan for Ukraine. Well, hotly debated at the European Council summit earlier this week, no decision was made, with Belgium maintaining serious legal concerns over the measure. European leaders, with the exception of Hungary's Viktor Orbán, have reportedly backed joint conclusions regarding EU's financial support for Ukraine. It remains unclear, however, how the much-discussed reparations loan, financed by frozen Russian assets, would be executed. A draft of the reparations loan has reportedly been backed by Belgium, which holds the frozen Russian assets and had previously expressed doubts about possible legal repercussions of using them to finance the loan. While the details remain unclear, Antonio Costa, President of the European Council, said that the EU is committed to addressing Ukraine's financial needs for the next 2 years, including military support. Progress on mobilizing frozen Russian assets to aid Ukraine is slow, but a decision should be made by the end of this year. This was a comment from Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk after the Thursday meeting of the European Council.
It would be too early today to say that Belgium and Luxembourg have been convinced 100% to use frozen Russian assets. What is important, though, not only from my point of view, but also from the point of view of Ukraine, Europe and NATO, is to stop the talk and make a decision. In December we have an assembly of the European Council, and the decision should be made then, yes or no. We should stop playing with emotions, because Ukraine will not win this war without financial aid.
US President Donald Trump has hit Russia's major oil companies with sanctions to pressure Vladimir Putin into agreeing to a peace deal. The move represents a significant U-turn for the Trump White House and comes as relations between Washington and Moscow appear to be cooling.
The Kremlin's nuclear firepower on full display as the US turns up the heat on Russia over its war against Ukraine. In a major shift, Donald Trump on Wednesday imposed sanctions on Russia as his frustration grows with Vladimir Putin over the war.
They're massive sanctions, and sanctions on oil. The two biggest oil companies, among the biggest in the world, but they're Russian. They do a lot of oil. And hopefully it'll push... hopefully he'll become reasonable.
The sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil aim to damage Moscow's ability to fund its war machine. The two companies are responsible for more than half of all Russian oil production. It comes after Trump cancelled a planned summit in Hungary with Putin.
It didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel like we were going to get to the place we have to get, so I cancelled it.
The White House has apparently become frustrated by Putin's intransigence over his maximalist demands, wanting Ukraine to cede land currently controlled by Kyiv. The NATO Secretary-General said he fully supports Trump's call for a ceasefire along the current front line.
Today we particularly focus on how can we end the war. What can I do, what can NATO do to support President Trump's vision of ending this war, ending the killing in Ukraine, including what we can do to make sure that Putin accepts the President's view that the two parties should stop where they are.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio later said the US would still like to meet with Russia. But the apparent olive branch wasn't enough to stop Russia's Ministry of Defense releasing video of a major training exercise involving nuclear weapons. They included practice launches of intercontinental ballistic missiles which are capable of striking the United States. President Trump and the West are now waiting for Putin's response to the sanctions on Russian oil.
I think this was an excellent move by President Trump, said Finnish President Alexander Stubb in response to the new US sanctions on Russian oil. Stubb explained that since Russia only understands power, he welcomes the move and more pressure on Moscow is needed.
I think this was an excellent move by President Trump. His negotiating method is somewhere between a carrot and a stick, and this is clearly a stick. He probably felt that President Putin promised him a ceasefire at the line of contact. That is what President Trump set out. And when that didn't happen, he decided it is time to put sanctions. And I agree with him. The only thing that Russia understands is power. We need to put more pressure on them, and we can do that through sanctions. And that's why I think President Trump's actions are great news.
Trump's new sanctions against Russia's oil giants Rosneft and Lukoil are wobbly. That's according to Geraldine Nihus, former Deputy Director of Defense and Security Cooperation at NATO, who joined TVP World News tonight. Nihus added that it remains to be seen whether the new US sanctions against Moscow, the first under the Trump administration, would be enacted.
Again, the devil is in the detail, because if you look into the way this is formulated, these sanctions would only commence on the 21st of November, so roughly a month from now. And then the language which they are using, they talk about they may result in sanctions, and they may run the risk of being sanctions. So it is not they will result, or this will be resulting in this. So it's all very wobbly. And in many ways, it remains to be seen whether those sanctions will really be enacted. Yeah, and in many ways, at least in my reading of what has happened, this is perfectly in line with the findings of a U.S. Minority Report prepared for the U.S. Senate in August this year. And one of this report main findings actually shows that the Trump administration immediately stopped taking basic sanctions and export control actions that had been maintained under the previous administration. And incidentally, they also reduced the staff to enact on these sanctions. So I will stand to be convinced that these sanctions these new sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil will be really imposed.
Chinese oil majors are suspending purchases of Russian oil after the US imposed sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, two of Russia's biggest oil companies, according to Reuters. India, the largest buyer of Russian oil, is reportedly poised to follow suit. China imports approximately 1.4 million barrels of Russian oil per day by sea, but the majority is brought in by independent refiners. Reports estimate that Chinese state-owned companies account for between 250,000 and 500,000 barrels per day. Another 900,000 barrels per day are imported to China from Russia via a pipeline, which experts say will be minimally affected by the sanctions. Both India and China are likely to turn to oil from the Middle East, Africa and Latin America. Two Russian military aircraft, an Su-30 fighter and Il-78 refueling tanker, briefly entered Lithuania's airspace on Thursday. The airspace's violation was condemned by the country's president, Gitanas Nausėda.
I strongly condemn the violation of Lithuanian airspace recently by the fighter jet and transport vehicle transport plane of Russian Federation from Kaliningrad region side. This is cruel violation of international law and territorial sovereignty of Lithuania, and we have to react to this.
Moscow's regional governor has claimed that a residential building was damaged in Krasnogorsk during an overnight drone attack. Andriy Vorobyov posted on Telegram that a drone flew into an apartment on the 14th floor of the building, according to the Kyiv Independent. A Ukrainian drone was reported to have previously hit a building in the area in June. Vorobyov claimed 5 people were taken to hospital for treatment in the aftermath. A Trump-Putin meeting is not completely off the table, but not until there's a prospect of a tangible positive outcome, says White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. Speaking to reporters, she explained that Trump does not feel that Putin is interested in moving towards peace, which was a factor in his decision to implement a new set of sanctions.
A meeting between these two leaders is not completely off the table. I think the president and the entire administration hopes that one day that can happen again. But we want to make sure that there's a tangible, positive outcome out of that meeting and that it's a good use of the president's time. Of course, he's traveling to Asia next week. He has a number of events coming up here on the home front as well. He's been incredibly busy, as you all know. You're all tired from covering him and his movements every day. And so we want to make sure it's a good use of the president's time. And the president doesn't want to waste his time, and he said that. I think the president has also long expressed his frustration with Vladimir Putin and, frankly, both sides of this war. And he's always said in order to negotiate a good peace deal, both sides need to be interested in a good peace deal. And he feels as though, unfortunately, from the Russian side as of late, he has not seen enough interest and enough action in terms of moving the ball forward towards peace.
M1A1 Abrams tanks donated to Ukraine by Australia are reportedly being deployed to the front line in the Donbas region. The US-made retired Australian Army tanks feature upgrades like the thermal sights and diesel engines to simplify Ukrainian logistics, according to the National Security Journal. Most of the 49 tanks pledged by Australia were delivered in July. Many of them are now being deployed to frontline units in the Donbas region after minor modifications. Ukrainian technicians have added additional reactive armor, frontal plating, and anti-drone cages to improve their survivability. The remaining tanks will be delivered in the coming months. In Georgia, there has reportedly been a significant rise in the number of anti-government protesters being arrested following a change in the law. Local media report that demonstrators on Thursday night staged a roadblock outside the parliament building in Tbilisi to highlight the law change that was introduced last week. The new rules replaced fines with imprisonment for protest-related offences, including road blocking and face covering. Protesters charged with such offences can face up to 15 days in prison for a first-time offence, with repeated offenders facing up to 2 years. Demonstrators say there's been a surge in detentions as police hunt people to arrest. Protesters have been blocking the road in front of the Georgian parliament every day since last December, when the government announced it was halting talks about joining the European Union. Political divisions on what should be a day of national unity. In Budapest, Thursday's commemorations of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution against the Soviet Union was seized by the two main opposing political parties to rally their supporters ahead of the next year's general elections. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán blamed the EU for Russia's refusal to negotiate an end to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and his main rival, Petr Magyar, called out Orbán on his pro-Kremlin positions and reported authoritarian tendencies.
Brussels did not hinder the US president's peace mission. The war would already be over. Everyone knows that if Donald Trump had been president, the war would never have broken out. And if they weren't hindering him now, there would already be peace. Brussels decided to go to war. The pro-war countries already formed a war alliance with inimitable elegance, calling it a coalition of the willing to send others to their deaths.
That politician who once demanded Russian troops leave Hungary is now the most loyal ally of the Kremlin. By today, he himself has built a system in which power is centralized, the press is under control, and the country is ruled by fear. The fate of Hungarians cannot be decided in Brussels, Washington or Moscow. Hungarians write their history in their own squares and streets, choosing to hope instead of fear. My dear friends, a country is reborn when people can believe in each other again. Let's believe that our country can rise up, can heal, and that our children will grow up in a freer, cleaner, and more human Hungary.
And that's a wrap for this news update. World Talks with Jonas Rewiński coming up next.